Om Tapakathamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibidiritam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Srimadatatam Bhuviganantiye Bhurida Janaha. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our ongoing class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Today we'll be discussing a relatively brief chapter that took place on Thursday, August 24th, 1882. So M, in the original Bangla, he gives the following chapter title. Niklanji, of course, omits these chapter titles, but here it is. The title for today's chapter. Kamini Kanchuni Joget Baghat. Sadhana or Jog Tattva. So, this famous term, this famous phrase, Kamini Kanchan, which comes up a million times in the text, M is using this term of Sri Ramakrishna's in the chapter heading. Kamini Kanchuni Joget Baghat. The main obstacle or hindrance to yoga is Kamini Kanchan. Kamini Kanchan. And we will discuss in a minute what the meaning of Kamini Kanchan is, because it's a little controversial and complicated, I think. It requires some nuance, I would suggest. And then the second part of this chapter title is Sadhana or Jog Tattva, which means spiritual practice, sadhana, and the essence of yoga. So that's the overarching theme of today's chapter. And I gave today's class the title Yoga and Bhoga, because there's a nice rhyme. I love rhymes. And what does bhoga mean? Anyone know? Huh? Enjoyment. Yeah, worldly enjoyment. So opposite of yoga. Okay? All right. Yes.
Doesn't it also mean like a food offering?
Yeah, that's true, yeah. If you want to offer food, well, because God is going to enjoy the food that we offer, and then we enjoy it when it becomes prasad. So there's a similarity there. Okay. So right off the bat, I want to mention. So we'll start with the first sentence of the translation, and then I'll point out. Well, you know what? No, I'll read the first bit of this chapter. Sri Ramakrishna was talking to Hajra on the long northeast veranda of his room when M arrived. He saluted the master reverently. Master, I should like to visit Ishwar Chandra Bidyasagar a few times more. The painter first draws the general outlines and then puts in the details and colors at his leisure. The molder first makes the image out of clay, then plasters it, then gives it a coat of whitewash, and last of all, paints it with a brush. All these steps must be taken successively. Vidyasagar is fully ready, but his inner stuff is covered with a thin layer. He is now engaged in doing good works, but he doesn't know what is within himself. Gold is hidden within him. God dwells within us. If one knows that, one feels like giving up all activities and praying to God with a yearning soul. So the master talked with M, now standing, now pacing up and down the long veranda. So let's pause here. Just a couple things I wanted to point out. First of all, in the original Bangla, it's mentioned that there are a few other people in the room besides M and Hajra and Sri Ramakrishna. It says, Ajkal Thakurer kache Hajra Mahashoy, Ramlal, Rakhal Prabhuti Thaken. Ramlal, the nephew of Sri Ramakrishna, is also there, and Rakhal, the famous Rakhal, the spiritual child of Sri Ramakrishna, the future Swami Brahmanandaji. And then there are a couple more sentences mentioned in the Bangla. Shri Jukta Ramlal Thakurer Bratush Putro, which means Ramlal was Thakur's, Sri Ramakrishna's nephew. So M is mentioning that. Kali Barite Puja Koren. Ramlal does puja in the Kali temple. Master Ashiya Dekhilen Uttar. And then the rest is there in the translation. Okay. And then another very small detail which is omitted, but I think it really does change the valence of what Sri Ramakrishna says. There's a whole paragraph on Sri Ramakrishna speaking about Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, right? We recently discussed his momentous meeting with him. He went to his house, had long discussions with him, and he was very impressed with him. But before he says, I should like to visit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar a few times more, in the Bangla it says, Thakur Sohasya Bodon, which means Sri Ramakrishna is smiling. I think that's significant because then you understand the tone of the whole thing. He's very warm. He's not saying this in a critical spirit. He's saying it out of love. The other thing I think might be worth mentioning is he keeps saying, he said this to Vidyasagar himself when he met him, and he's repeating the same thing. He's saying, all these things you're doing are wonderful. All these good works you're doing, you have great scholarship also, and yet you don't know that God is within your heart. And once you know that, you're going to drop everything and then just call on God. So I think one thing that this reminds me of, at least, is that in the Gita, for instance, there's a doctrine of the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. And we always need to remember in spiritual life that the goal is not becoming sattvic. The goal is to transcend the three gunas. At the same time, I tend to say in my classes and talks that people want to skip steps and kind of race to going beyond the three gunas. But I think it behooves us to very carefully try to cultivate sattva guna. That needs to be our first priority in spiritual life. But he's speaking to a very advanced, highly spiritually evolved soul, in my opinion, Vidyasagar. Somebody who's done a lot of spiritual practice already, and so he's ready to take that next step, going from sattva guna. Without sattva, you couldn't live a life in the way that he did, completely dedicated to serving humanity and without typical worldly desires. So the goal is, of course, going beyond the three gunas, but always remember, for most of us, we're stuck with rajas and tamas. You should be honest with yourself and ask yourself, if you're lazy and you like to sleep a lot and you have exhibit certain vices like jealousy and this and that, that's more tamasic. If you're very ambitious, full of worldly desires, extremely passionate, your life is full of emotional highs and lows, that's more rajas. Sattva, if you have a lot of sattva, there's a calmness, there's a kind of equanimity, an equilibrium. You tend not to be so enamored with things in the outside world. The mind is more inward, indrawn. So we each need to figure it out for ourselves. Where do we stand and how do we move forward from there? Okay, so now, next. Can you turn down the temperature a little? You don't know how? Yeah, thanks. It's a little stuffy. Okay, so now, next section. In the original Bangla, M starts a new section within this chapter. And the section title is Sadhana, which means spiritual practice, sadhana. And then Kamini Kanchunir Jhor Tufan Kataibar Junno. This is a metaphor used by Sri Ramakrishna himself, as we're about to see. What he's saying is, we need to engage in spiritual practice to endure, to weather the high winds and the storm of Kamini Kanchan. Again, that term Kamini Kanchan comes up again. Okay? Lust and greed, or lust and gold. We'll see. There are multiple translations here. I'm going to suggest my own take on it in a second. So, now let's see what he says in this section. Master, a little spiritual discipline is necessary in order to know what lies within. M. Is it necessary to practice discipline all through life? Master, no. But one must be up and doing in the beginning. After that, one need not work hard. The helmsman stands up and clutches the rudder firmly as long as the boat is passing through waves, storms, high wind, or around the curves of a river. But he relaxes after steering through them. As soon as the boat passes the curves and the helmsman feels a favorable wind, he sits comfortably and just touches the rudder. Next, he prepares to unfurl the sail and gets ready for a smoke. Likewise, the aspirant enjoys peace and calm after passing the waves and storms of woman and gold. So Nikhilanji tends to translate Kamini Kanchan as woman and gold. The first time that this term occurs, he has a long footnote explaining the meaning of this, and it's a very helpful footnote. I've read it in the past. I'm going to have trouble finding it now. But in any case, wow, look at that. We got an encyclopedia here, a living encyclopedia. 84. Wait, I looked it up. It's not there. No. Oops. Yeah, I think this is the New York edition. Anyway, that's okay. Okay, so there are a couple things here. First of all, this term, Kamini Kanchan, I devoted almost an entire class to it in the past. I'm just going to talk about it very briefly here. Okay. This phrase is comprised of two words, Kamini plus Kanchan. Sri Ramakrishna says a million times, renounce these two things. And Nikhilanji translates this phrase as woman and gold. This, rightly, I think many women feel a little hurt by this or puzzled and say, what's going on here? But one thing I think we need to keep in mind is that in Indian languages, and particularly in Bengali, there are many words for woman. And each word for woman has subtly different connotations. And I think he's using this particular word for a specific reason. Kamini literally means woman viewed as an object of desire or lust. Kamini literally means that. So there are much more neutral words for woman in Bengali. Stri, for instance, lady, woman. But this is a very specific word, Kamini. Viewing women as an object of lust, or seeing women as an object of lust or desire, that's what needs to be renounced. So hopefully that's not as disturbing or offensive a way of understanding the term. Some people choose to translate Kamini Kanchan as, there are multiple translations, like alternatives. Like one is lust and gold. Okay, so they translate Kamini as lust and Kanchan as gold. Kanchan is gold, there's no doubt. Obviously, it's not meant just to mean gold. It can mean any kind of currency, material possessions, material wealth in general, right? But the problem I see with that translation, so Kamini equals lust, Kanchan equals gold, is that it's a kind of category mistake. Because Kamini, meaning lust, means it's a desire. It's a desire for women, right? Or for whoever you're attracted to, whoever that might be. Nowadays, okay.
That's why it shouldn't be woman. That's why it should be lust.
Right, okay, but I still object on several grounds to rendering it as lust and gold. Because lust is a kind of desire, it's internal. But gold is the external object, right? And so that's why I say it's a category mistake. You're mixing up two different things.
You take away the sexual aspect of it and neutralize it by using lust instead of denigrating the woman once again through past history. It balances out, trust me.
Yeah, but did you miss what I said about I don't think the best translation of Kamini is woman.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right. Okay, so we're on the same page. Yeah. So woman is not the right translation, I think. But as I said, viewing women as an object of lust, that's what needs to be renounced. He says in many places, a sadhu should never have oihik chokhu in Bangla, which aihika chakshu, which means worldly vision. So when you see things, you shouldn't see things in a worldly way. Looking at women as an object of lust, for instance, is one of the ways that you'd have worldly vision. So that's what needs to be renounced. Okay, but lust and gold, I think, has the problem of that one is an internal desire, the other is the external object. So a more consistent translation, which some people prefer, is lust and greed. Kamini equals lust, and Kanchan equals greed. So they're both internal desires. That makes more sense. My quibble with that is that Sri Ramakrishna was a Jagat Guru. He was a universal guru. He was a great teacher. And he understood that a young person coming to a guru, and the guru, just imagine the guru saying, renounce lust. What the heck is that person supposed to do? It's difficult. And you can't just choose to renounce lust. You can choose. It's still hard, but you can choose to renounce the object of desire. But it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to just on the spot renounce an internal desire. So he had a genius for concretion. And there's a reason why he said you need to renounce the external thing in order ultimately to renounce the internal longing or desire. Right? The goal is to renounce lust and greed. But the practical teaching is renounce the external objects for which you lust and after which you greed, After which you greed? You greed after? No. Toward which you greed? Wait. Toward which you feel greedy. Okay, I'm getting confused. Okay, so my suggestion is we leave the term untranslated. That has its own issues, of course. But I think that the best course of action is to leave Kamini Kanchan as Kamini Kanchan. Keeping it, because it's unwieldy if you actually render it the way I want, which is renounce viewing women as an object of lust and renounce gold or material possessions or material wealth. So instead, Kamini Kanchan, knowing what those terms really mean. But anyway, I'm sure you guys have questions about that. We can talk about it. Or do you have any comments now or questions about that before we move on? Can you give the mic to him?
Since Ramakrishna always sort of viewed the parallel female aspect of everything by worshiping Mother and Kali, they don't mention, they're always talking God, and they're always still referencing as he. I still say you should, at this juncture in 2024, stop using the feminized version, or use more of it as you pepper it in with the rest of the sermons. Instead of saying God is he, you should say God is she more often.
Absolutely.
But they don't do that, which is interesting to me.
Well, I think I know why, because Nikhilanji was writing for a Western Christian audience in the mid-1900s, and they're used to thinking of God as he, God the Father. But I'm fully with you that in the context of the gospel, we should really render God as she. Yeah. And the other thing that I think is helpful that you bring up indirectly is that Sri Ramakrishna would say again and again that the best way to look upon woman is as a manifestation of divine Shakti, as Divine Mother herself. That's extremely important. It's important to keep in mind that as well when we think about Kamini Kanchan. Can you bring the mic to Preeti?
So, okay, I just had one point about you were saying, about internal desire versus renouncing the external object.
Correct.
As far as that applies to the gold idea, that's not necessarily consistent because, I don't think Tagore would say that, one should never touch money again or that you're not supposed to use it as necessary for life. So it's there's a sense in which that's not necessarily consistent.
You're saying... still, don't you think that having too much is what is going? I mean, not having the necessity. Yeah, having the basic amount or minimal amount is okay. I think,
having too much is different than saying renounce the object altogether.
Right. Oh, yeah. No, I think that's right. Yeah. And even with householders, he's not saying renounce it completely, but just be self-controlled, and so it depends on whom he's speaking to. I would say, yeah. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
So, in your opinion, what's he saying that to give up the taste for it?
Bring it. I don't know what's going on. Oh, that's too bad.
So,
Shout, or I'll repeat the question for the online. Yeah, go ahead.
So, Sri Ramakrishna was saying that in order to give up the taste for something, first just give up the object. Sort of like if you stop eating sweets, eventually you'll stop having the desire for it. I think I've mixed it up, but if you give up the object, eventually the inner renunciation will happen.
Well, actually, okay, what she's asking, it's an interesting question. The logic seems to be that if you give up the external object, eventually the inner desire will also go away. Not quite, actually. It depends on where you are in your spiritual journey. And if you're full of a very strong desire for something, better to employ the method that he's about to explain. So great segue into the next section. Okay, but he's not letting me. Okay, so go ahead.
Commented about the God using she pronouns, asking, isn't God beyond male and female? If you could maybe address that.
Yeah, sure. That's a nice question. Yeah, so God is he, God is she, God is it, God is beyond all pronouns. That's true. But in the context of the gospel, who was Sri Ramakrishna's Ishtadevata? This should be obvious to everybody. Kali, Mother Kali. So unless he's specifically thinking of a masculine form of God, whether that's Krishna or Shiva or Ganesha or Hanuman, the default assumption should be that God is she. It seems like a no-brainer to me. Now, a tricky thing is that in the Bengali language, the pronoun is it could be either masculine or feminine, so you could push it in either direction. There aren't separate pronouns for male and female. But in the context of the gospel, I think it's more reasonable to take God as she, unless he's specifically talking about a male deity. Okay? All right, so let's move on and we'll get to Anna's question as well. Okay, he says, some are born with the characteristics of the yogi, but they too should be careful. It is Kamini Kanchan alone that is the obstacle. It makes them deviate from the path of yoga and drags them into worldliness. Perhaps they have some desire for enjoyment. After fulfilling their desire, they again direct their minds to God and thus recover their former state of mind, fit for the practice of yoga. Have you ever seen the spring trap for fish called the shotkakal? M. No, sir, I haven't seen it. Master. They use it in our part of the country. One end of a bamboo pole is fastened in the ground, and the other is bent over with a catch. From this end, a line with a hook hangs over the water, with bait tied to the hook. When the fish swallows the bait, suddenly the bamboo jumps up and regains its upright position. Again, take a pair of scales, for example. If a weight is placed on one side, the lower needle moves away from the upper one. The lower needle is the mind, and the upper one, God. The meeting of the two is yoga. Unless the mind becomes steady, there cannot be yoga. It is the wind of worldliness that always disturbs the mind, which may be likened to a candle flame. If that flame doesn't move at all, then one is said to have attained yoga. Kamini Kanchan alone is the obstacle to yoga. Always analyze what you see. What is there in the body of a woman? Only such things as blood, flesh, fat, entrails, and the like. Why should one love such a body? Okay, I'm hearing some groans. All right. Anyway, so this is M has given this section of the gospel of this chapter a new title, so I'm going to read that to you. It's long actually, but very descriptive. Thakur Sri Ramakrishna or Yoga Tattva. Thakur Sri Ramakrishna and the essence of yoga. Yoga Bhrashta, Yoga Bhrashta. This is a term used in the Bhagavad Gita. Yoga Bhrashta, one who has fallen from yoga. Okay? And then the title continues, it's a long title. Yogavastha, the state of being in yoga. Being in the state of yoga. And then he's using a Sanskrit phrase, and he's putting it in quotes. Nivata nishkampam iva pradipam. A light or a flame which is completely unwavering and which is unshaken. Okay, completely still flame. Which we're going to see as a reference to Bhagavad Gita. And finally, the title ends, Joged Baghat, the main obstacle or hindrance to yoga. Okay, so that's a big section title. So now, the first thing to mention, as I said, is that Yoga Bhrashta is a term that, it's a very unique term actually, and it comes from Gita 6.41. Krishna says, Arjuna is sort of worried in chapter 6, because in chapter 6, Krishna is giving this whole very glowing description of all these very impressive yogic practices, like meditation, deep meditation, concentration. You have to renounce all sense objects and focus on the Atman within and this and that, all these things. And Arjuna is kind of like, oh my goodness, where does that leave me? So he says, well, what happens if we start on this path, but then we don't actually attain the highest goal? Is all hope lost? Do we have to start from scratch again? And then Krishna assures him, no effort is lost on the spiritual path. Nothing bad can befall someone who engages in spiritual practice. And then he says, 6.41, Prapya punyakatan lokan ushitva shashvati samaha shuchinam shrimatam gehe yoga bhrashto vijayate. Yoga bhrashto vijayate. So, what happens to the person who very sincerely engages in spiritual practices, yoga, is somehow maybe tempted by something in the world, or just doesn't quite reach the end? What happens? He becomes a yoga bhrashta, which means one who has fallen from yoga. Then what happens? After that person leaves the physical body, that person dwells in a higher loka, a higher realm, of divine celestial enjoyments, having a nice time there for a while, for a long time. And then eventually, though, all good things come to an end. And so he comes back to this world in another body, but in a nice, pure family, spiritually inclined family, and continues on the spiritual path. It's like a savings account. However much you save up in this life, spiritually speaking, you get that balance in your next life as well. You don't start from zero again. Okay? Okay, so that's the first thing to keep in mind. I think Sri Ramakrishna is very definitely thinking of Gita 6.41 here. He knew the Gita very well. Another thing is, these metaphors he's using, one is very obscure because we're not used to village fishing, or at least from 19th century Indian village fishing with bamboo poles. But we get the idea, right? There's a pair of scales, there's a special... The idea is what? So long as a mind is weighted down with worldly attachments, worldly desires, it cannot think of God. So that through spiritual practice, we try to purify our minds, get rid of our worldly attachments and worldly desires. And the moment we do that, what happens? The mind becomes light. And just like the bamboo pole becomes upright again, then we're able to enter the state of yoga. Or when in a weighing scale, right, the weight of worldliness is pulling down, it's making the other one come up. When you remove that, then the mind can think of God, right? So I'm reminded of, what's the famous teaching of Jesus's, which is very similar to this? Anyone? No person can serve two masters. You can choose God or mammon, but not both, right? It's the same idea. You can't have yoga and bhoga at the same time. Although nowadays it's become an almost industry to kind of teach you that you can have your cake and eat it too. It's just that you can here's your spirituality, but don't think that you have to give up bhoga. You can also do bhoga, but it'll be spiritual bhoga. And spiritual... that sells. You'll have a lot more followers if you can somehow combine yoga and bhoga. It's not as popular to just say you have to renounce bhoga in order to attain yoga, but that's what Sri Ramakrishna is very emphatically saying. And I think there's really no two ways about it. Kathopanishad, one of our great Vedantic scriptures, there's a wonderful mantra there describing two paths that confront every human being. Shreyascha preyascha manushyame tastau sampariti vivinakti dhiraha. Shreyo hidhirobi preyaso vrinite preyo mando yogakshemad vrinite. Two paths confront every human being. The path of Shreya and the path of Preya. What does Shreya mean? Swami Vivekananda gives really nice translations for these terms. He says, Shreya is the path of perfection, spiritual perfection. And Preya is the path of enjoyment, worldly enjoyment. So there's the path of yoga leading to perfection and the path of bhoga. The wise person separates these two paths, distinguishes between these two paths, and decides wisely to tread on the path of Shreya, the path of perfection, spiritual perfection. And the person who is very body conscious and is not spiritually minded, the fool actually, the word fool is used quite a bit in the Upanishads, chooses the path of enjoyment, okay, and then misses the highest goal, fails to reach the highest goal. But Shankara, in his commentary on this verse, on this mantra, says something really nice. He says, notice that the mantra doesn't say there are two paths and the smart person, the wise person, treads the path of Shreya, the perfection. There's a step before that. Discrimination between these two paths. Recognizing these two paths as distinct paths. Because as I said, the great temptation here is to confuse bhoga, the path of bhoga, for the path of yoga. So there are many people who think that they're engaging in yoga, spiritual practice. I'm on the path of perfection, when in fact they're on the opposite path. And as long as you're deceiving yourself into thinking that you're on the path of yoga, you're going to be making reverse progress. I mean, you're going to be regressing rather than progressing, right? So that's why Shankara says the first step is make sure you have clarity about which actually is the path of perfection and which is the path of enjoyment. And make sure, and then you can choose the right one. Most people mix it up. Okay? Okay, so now let's look at and then at the very end of what I just read, where I got the groans, I wanted to just address that briefly. I'll read the Bangla here. Kamani kanchuni joger baghat. So kamani kanchan is the main obstacle to yoga. Bostu bichar korbe. This is important. Sri Ramakrishna, in many places in the Gospel, recommends engaging in vichara, which vichara just means reasoning. But he specifies that there are different kinds of vichara, different kinds of reasoning for spiritual aspirants. One that's very common, which he uses a lot, the term is shot ashot vichar, sat asat vichara, which is discrimination between sat and asat. What's permanent, what's impermanent. What's real, what's unreal. So what alone is permanent? God, Ishod. Everything else is impermanent. Right? But he's not saying sadasat vichari here. He's saying bostu vichar. Vastu vichara is the Sanskrit here. Vastu, which means the substance. Exercise reasoning. Reason about the object of your desire. That's the idea. Why is he talking about the female body? Because he's talking to heterosexual men, or men that he presumed to be heterosexual. Let me put it that way. Okay? That's the only reason why. He said exactly the same thing in the opposite direction when he's talking to women. And he would tell women, what is in the body of a man? But the same stuff. Same blood and entrails and flesh and guts and all that. This is actually a very old practice. You find this in Buddhist texts all over the place. What's the idea? The idea is, if somebody is strongly attracted to another person's body, one effective practice is to to kind of dissect that body, like you do on frogs in school and whatever. Maybe you don't do that anymore. Is that like, I don't know anymore. Anyway, I did it, I think, in 7th grade or something. But you kind of do a mental version of that. In order to what? In order to break that infatuation for that body. Because after all, in spiritual life, what's the goal? To realize that we're not bodies. We're souls. We're eternal, perfect souls, sparks of the divine fire. And so we have to learn gradually to see ourselves as souls rather than bodies, and to see other people as souls rather than bodies. So that's the context. He's not picking on women here. He's speaking to heterosexual men. Okay. Now, let's go to the next section. This is the last section in the chapter. He says, sometimes, and this finally addresses Anna's question. It's a very interesting question. Okay. Sometimes I used to assume a rajasic mood in order to practice renunciation. Once I had the desire to put on a gold-embroidered robe, wear a ring on my finger, and smoke a hubble bubble with a long pipe. Muthur Babu procured all these things for me. He's a very rich man who helped Sri Ramakrishna. I wore the gold-embroidered robe and said to myself after a while, mind, this is what is called a gold-embroidered robe. Then I took it off and threw it away. I couldn't stand the robe anymore. Again, I said to myself, mind, this is called a shawl, and this a ring, and this smoking a hubble bubble with a long pipe. I threw those things away once for all, and the desire to enjoy them never arose in my mind again. It was almost dusk. The master and M stood talking alone near the door on the southeast veranda. Master to M. The mind of the yogi is always fixed on God, always absorbed in the self. You can recognize such a man by merely looking at him. His eyes are wide open, with an aimless look, like the eyes of the mother bird hatching her eggs. Her entire mind is fixed on the eggs, and there is a vacant look in her eyes. Can you show me such a picture? M. I shall try to get one. Okay, a few things here. First of all, addressing Anna's question. What is the best way to overcome our worldly desires? There's no one way. There are multiple methods. And in fact, there's no real one-size-fits-all answer to that question. That's why a good guru will understand the disciple and where that disciple is at and give instructions accordingly. So, for instance, Sri Ramakrishna taught Turiyanandaji, the future Turiyanandaji, Hari at the time. Or was it Yogananda? Now I'm getting confused. I think it was Turiyanandaji. I hope so. Okay. Anyway, this person is struggling with lust. And Sri Ramakrishna just, and this person was doing all sorts of kind of hatha yoga practices, thinking that that would reduce his lust and ultimately eliminate that lust. And Sri Ramakrishna said, all you have to do is take Hari's name. That's all you have to do. I think it's Yogananda, but you guys, anyone online or whoever can correct me on that. And he was very skeptical because people like concrete things. They want to blow their nose and like do stuff. So there's not, just take God's name, that's enough. So he's skeptical, but he did it. And voila, eureka, it worked. So it depends. And so what Sri Ramakrishna is saying here is that he was in a particular mood. He says a rajasic mood, which means he's bringing these three gunas, right? I think the implication is that if you're very sattvic, you wouldn't engage in this method. You would just renounce the object. The rajasic mood is, let me experience this once. Ask myself, am I getting out of this experience what I'm looking for? And then see what the answer is. And he does it. He wears that gold embroidered robe. What happens? Not that great. And in fact, in the Leela Prasanga, it's recorded that when he's describing the sadhana, that after he gets disgusted with it, he throws it on the ground and starts trampling over it. And it's a very expensive robe, so Motu Baba was like, wait. I got to return that. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that the last sentence describing this spiritual practice, I'll read the English and then I'll read the original Bengali because I think there's a subtle difference. Here's the translation. I threw those things away once for all, and the desire to enjoy them never arose in my mind again. Okay. But what he says is slightly different. Sheje shob fililam ad mone utinai. It's a very subtle difference. It's very hard to explain. I don't know if I could translate it better, but I just want to convey the idea here. Sheje shob fililam ad mone utinai. The idea is that for some people, they need to actually go through the experience once. And then when they say, you know what, this isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Once the mind makes that resolve and actually arrives at that point, what happens? There's a natural kind of renunciation. That's why Sri Ramakrishna would say, Bhoganto na hole tag ashana, which means until one has reached the end of enjoyments, one cannot feel the true spirit of renunciation. Okay, and that's why spiritual life is a journey of many lifetimes, because each of us is at a different place. Swami Brahmanandaji, he used to say that there are 3 grades of people. At the lowest grade are people who have to undergo the same experience again and again, and they don't learn from it. And because they don't learn from it, what happens? They're doomed to undergo the same experience again. They have to come back in another body, and they're trapped in the cycle of rebirth. Eventually, they'll be saved. They'll eventually be liberated, but it takes many, 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 many lifetimes. There's a higher grade of spiritual aspirant. These are people who undergo a worldly experience once or twice or thrice, learn from the experience, and then say, okay, I'm not going to do that again. And then they make, quite a bit of spiritual progress. They eventually reach the goal. And then he says there's a third category. He says the highest grade of person is the person who, without having to undergo the worldly experience him or herself, observes other people undergoing that experience, seeing all the sorrow, the despair, the trouble that it entails, and says, I don't need to do that myself. So you learn from the experiences of others. Okay. And so this rajasic mood, I think, would fall into this second category. We can even give it a name if we want. I think this is it's a powerful spiritual practice, which I think is applicable to many people. Mindful enjoyment. That's the word. That's the phrase I'm giving it. Mindful enjoyment. Enjoy. If you want to enjoy, but enjoy mindfully. Swami Vivekananda would say, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. That's mindful enjoyment. Education through experience. If you want to experience something, go ahead and experience it, but do it with your eyes open. That's mindful enjoyment. And ask yourself whether you get out of that experience what you're looking for. Yeah. So that's a legitimate path. And I think that it could also be very effective for many people.
It made me think of, sometimes the spiritual teacher will tell you to go to a graveyard and look at the tombstones or just meditate in a graveyard about how transitory life is. That's kind of like maybe a Rajasic way of, it's not very Rajasic.
I don't know if that's Rajasic. That could be more. Yeah. But because it's gruesome, you mean, is that what it means? Or in what sense?
That you could be dying at any time, or that you're definitely going to be passing out of the body.
Yeah. But why do you think that's Rajasic? Why would you?
I don't know if it's Rajasic.
Okay.
But it just came to my mind that that's another practice that you could do to attain detachment.
Yeah. Sorry?
It's a grave mistake as well.
It's a grave mistake. He's making a pun. Yes. Yeah. So different kinds of sadhana. See, so one method is, as Anna was pointing out earlier, which is just renounce the external object, and then ultimately you can renounce the internal desire. But it depends on where you're at. And if the desire is very strong, this Rajasic method could be much, much more effective. Mindful enjoyment, the path of mindful enjoyment. So other questions?
I have an observation.
Yeah.
You said it was only directed at heterosexual men. That wouldn't be true. If you're denigrating or describing a woman's body from the inside out in a grotesque way, that means you don't
Appeal to the female body, that would include maybe a lesbian woman as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah. At the time, we're talking like 1880s in India.
But I still think it's a sexist point of view from now, because we're into 2020.
Yeah. But we should be careful about not making the mistake of reading our own assumptions and into the past and criticize past figures for,
No, it was an observation.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. But this is just more of a general point, is that it's a thing called presentism, which is that we're in 2024, and then we read 2024 back into the 19th century or, first century, and it gets tricky. Okay, let me read some of the online questions here. What are the... Okay, I don't know what this has to do with the with the class today. Let me first try to find some. Okay, hold on. Prasanna's asking a good question here. Namaskaram Maharaj. If Kamini Kanchan teaching is for men, what should women devotees take away from it? That's a very good question. Well, it's what Sri Ramakrishna taught when he spoke to his female disciples. He said you should renounce men. So exactly the same thing, but just in the opposite direction. And don't look at men as objects of lust and as objects of attraction, right? And men to woo and this and that. And so exactly the same thing, but just in the reverse direction. And the conscience stays the same because that's universal in human nature across the board, to possess things. It might manifest in different forms. Men might like cars, and I don't want to say anything here. I'm going to get in trouble. So, but men might like cars. Okay. All right. Okay. SM is asking, as householders or students, we don't spend as much time doing spiritual practices like japa, meditation, etc. So how does performing one's swadharma lead us to God and bhakti? Yes. Okay. So that's a good question. It's a very practical question. Here, the word swadharma here is a term that comes from the Bhagavad Gita. And I like Sri Aurobindo's translation of the term, which is your own law of being. Okay? And what the Gita says is, engage in karma yoga. Try to convert your karma, your work, into karma yoga, into a spiritual practice. How do you do it? First of all, by identifying your swadharma. What is your own law of being? What are your strengths? And based on your inherent strengths and qualities, find a vocation or a calling, a line of work, that helps you to cultivate those strengths on a daily basis, on a regular basis. And then, that's still not karma yoga. How do you make it karma yoga? By offering that work that you do to the best of your ability to the divine. Then it becomes karma yoga. Because so long as even if you're really good at something and you do it really well, but you're very egoistic about it, and you take great pride in the fact that you're doing that work, you brag to other people about it, you take credit for everything you're doing, that's still not karma yoga. And you're looking for name and fame and recognition, not karma yoga. So this is why I see a kind of lacuna in positive psychology, Western positive psychology. Martin Seligman has a book called Authentic Happiness, which I talk about a lot in my classes and talks. And there, he says that the secret to living a genuinely happy life, to discover authentic happiness, is in 2 steps. Number 1, identify your signature strengths. And number 2, find a vocation, a line of work that helps you to cultivate those strengths on a daily basis, right? But I think that there's a 3rd step that's crucially missing here, which is converting that work into karma yoga by trying to take the ego out of that work. So try not to be attached to the work itself. What do I mean by that? Some people are workaholics and they're addicted to the work, so that even if their boss gives them a 2-week vacation, they're going to freak out. They get restless, and even when they're on the beach in the Bahamas sipping Mai Tai, they're thinking about their work and why did my coworker say that to me? And then also you have to renounce attachment to the fruits of your actions, the fruits of your work. What are the fruits? Could be getting a salary, maybe getting a promotion, getting recognition, name and fame and praise, success, failure, all these things. If you're attached to those fruits, that's not quite karma yoga. It's not all or nothing either. That's another thing that's really important. It's not 100% ego in my work or 0% ego. It's a struggle. It's difficult. And so when you first try to convert your work into karma yoga, it might be 90% ego and 10% unselfish. And then as you progress on the path, it'll become 80-20, 70-30. That's the way I think these things work realistically. So that is the path of karma yoga, and that is a very good path for those who don't have too much time for meditation and japa. But that's not an excuse, and whatever time you have, you should still try to engage in japa. Another thing is, you don't have to actually set aside an hour in the meditation room to do japa. You should if you have the time. But if you don't, when you're stuck in traffic, instead of exhibiting road rage, as people in LA tend to, do japa, take God's name. What a wonderful thing. It'll change your whole attitude toward rush hour traffic in the commute. And you'll start blessing people instead of cursing them when you're on the road. And even if they say something mean and nasty to you, then you won't be affected by it. So it's a good test, actually. Driving in LA is a good spiritual test. Another question. How can I become a monk at the Ramakrishna Mission? Any advice? All right. No, I wish you all the best. May God bless you. I think he said earlier about householders, etc., don't necessarily have to renounce all of it, but need to be balanced and not mature. Okay, hold on. I'm trying to find something I understand here. Okay. Okay, there's a kind of side discussion on what is swadharma. Let me clear this up. I think it is a fairly important issue here. Somebody asked, is swadharma based on the varna one is born into? Chaturvanyam maya srishtam gunakarmi bhagashaha, Gita 4.13. And then Amit says, no, swadharma is not based on varna you are born into. Okay, so there's, as I said, a side debate. It's kind of interesting, actually. Yes, so in the Gita, Krishna does define swadharma in terms of the 4 castes. But the key question is, what determines one's caste? Is it heredity? Gita says no. The answer gives is guna karma vibhagashaha. I have created these 4 castes based on people's gunas and karmas. Gunas means inherent qualities and strengths, the kind of things we were talking about, and weaknesses. And karma is your behavior, how you behave in this world. Some people have great innate qualities, but they don't act on them. Some people don't have the best, it wasn't the best hand that was dealt to them, but they live incredibly inspiring lives, right? So both those things have to be in place. So Krishna says, caste is based on these 2 things, your innate qualities and your behavior, which means they're malleable. And nobody's born into a caste. You determine caste based on a kind of self-evaluation in a way. This is kind of similar to if you're at a university, you speak to a career counselor, and they have you fill out a survey to determine your strengths and weaknesses and this and that, personality tests, and then you can isolate what career, what trajectory might be good for you, right? That kind of idea. And Wow, this is a big side debate, huh? This really goes on for... Okay, all right, well... Okay, how about this? Ram is asking, you are indicating that some people learn quickly and some don't. So is it about sankalpa? Sankalpa, I don't know what you mean by sankalpa. Sankalpa means resolve or vow, right? But I'm not sure what... So yeah, I mean determination maybe, is that what you mean? Dhriti? Look, it's not about... one thing I like about Sri Ramakrishna is that he's not judgmental. Like, let me read it again, this paragraph. He says, some have the characteristics of a yogi, but they too should be careful. It is Kamini Kanchan alone that is the obstacle. It makes them deviate from the path of yoga and drags them into worldliness. Perhaps they have some desire for enjoyment. After fulfilling their desire, they again direct their minds to God and thus recover their former state of mind, fit for the practice of yoga. There's no judgment here. There's no condemnation. There's just... Because everybody's going to make it in the end. That's the thing. It's very reassuring, actually. Vedanta says every single one. Sri Ramakrishna would say, everybody will be fed. Some people at 6 in the morning, others at 12 p.m., others at 6 p.m., others at midnight, but nobody will be left out. No eternal hell, thank God. And so it takes the edge off. And yes, some people, and in these Puranas, these Hindu Puranas are full of tales of great yogis doing austerities for thousands of years, standing on one toe and this and that, and then suddenly there's an apsara, which means like an extremely beautiful nymph, and they look at her through the corner of her eye, and then it's all done. But don't worry, there's still hope. There's hope for everybody. That's the idea. That's part of the lesson of all these stories. Yeah, because we learn from our mistakes. We learn from our experiences. As Swamiji says, we don't go from error to truth. We go from lower truth to higher truth, right? The secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. And, okay, Asim. Another term for mindful enjoyment is enrichment. The same experience, like a cake, can enrich in one instance and distract in another if it's only a stimulation of the senses. Does anyone get what that means? Okay. But it's an interesting observation. Yeah. Okay. And then, okay. Any questions here in the in-person audience? No?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm. Can we give the mic to him?
I don't know if I totally agree with your not being able to enjoy life, because you're only here. I mean, of course we have past lives. I believe that. I perceive that. But while you're here, I think you really should try to enjoy things, because there's so much negativity around you. You really have to try to absorb, screen out your thoughts, of course, and try to stay positive and enjoy, because life is so much more rich when you're interconnected and you're in sync with everything.
Absolutely.
You're not going to go down the drain if you're in sync.
Yeah, I think that's a nice point. Look, something that Swamiji said many times is, religion is not for dyspeptics. Religion is not for, a religious person is not somebody who's always looking very dour and, looks like they're in great pain at all times and very serious. No, look at one of the wonderful things about the gospel. On Labor Day, we've got a big gospel day. The whole morning will be a marathon gospel reading session. In the afternoon, we'll have 11 people giving 5-minute speeches on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And one of them, Prabhangshu, I think, will be speaking on Sri Ramakrishna's sense of humor. Every page of this book is full of everybody laughs, hysterical laughter, Sri Ramakrishna cutting jokes. That's spiritual. You should enjoy life, yes, but enjoy life in the right way, right? That's also that conversation that Swamiji had with that scientist, Ingersoll. Learn how to enjoy life the right way, and then you can really be happy. So Isha Upanishad, first mantra. Can anyone just rattle it off? Om Isha Vasyamidagga Sarvam Yat Kincha Jagatyan Jagat Tena Tyaktena Bhunjitha Magrida Kasya Svidhanam. Second line. Well, first line first. This entire world is blanketed by, is covered by the divine. There's nothing in this world but the divine. Therefore, says the second line, Tena tyaktena bhunjitha magrida kasya svidhanam. So, you should enjoy this world, the very thing you're talking about. How? Tena tyaktena. So bhunjitaha is the word for enjoy. Literally, it comes from the same, notice that it's the same root word as bhoga. Bhunj, which means to enjoy. Bhunjitaha. Tena tyaktena bhunjitaha. Enjoy this world through renunciation. That doesn't mean we have to become monks to enjoy. Renounce the inner desire. Renounce egoism, selfishness, and inner desire. Then you can truly enjoy this world. So spiritual life is all about enjoyment, but spiritual enjoyment, enjoying in the right way through renunciation of worldly attachments and desires. Okay? Yes. Any other last comments or questions? Kamini Kanchan? Yeah. Oh, there is? Okay. What? Go ahead. Oh, this one, right. Proful Kuptiya Kaptiyal. What should one do if one feels dispassion towards worldly objects, but no attraction towards God, the supernatural? Is there a materialistic version to asceticism? Oh, that's a very interesting question. Yeah, there's a place in the Gospel when Sri Ramakrishna asks M to define vairagya, detachment or dispassion. And M gives a wonderful answer which Sri Ramakrishna is very pleased with. He says, Bishoyar prati birag, or Ishwara prati unurag. It has two dimensions, true detachment, true dispassion. On the one hand, it's intense detachment toward worldly objects. But that's not all. At the same time, simultaneously, there's intense attraction toward what? God. So the two things should be going hand in hand. And she's asking, or he, Proful, maybe he, but I'm not sure. Profulla would be more, I don't know. Huh? Yeah, I know, but Proful, that's where I'm getting stuck because it's double L, and then, okay, maybe this person will tell me soon. Anyway, so she's asking, I'm just going to say she here. Default she, like you were saying earlier. Okay, so she's asking, well, what if you feel only dispassion toward the things of the world, but you don't feel any love for God? Which is very interesting. Like, think of somebody like Vidyasagar. I think that's a good example. He had tremendous detachment from the things of the world, and yet he didn't seem to feel much of anything for God. At least he didn't think he did. Right? And Sri Ramakrishna explained why, because there's a thin layer covering over the gold within. And so this person is asking, is there a materialistic version to asceticism? Yeah, so the thing is, look, Buddhism is all about, Buddhism, don't you think Buddhism also teaches the need for the same kind of detachment and renunciation? Of course, but without any kind of inclination toward God, because it's either agnostic or atheistic depending on how you interpret the Buddha's teachings and what school of Buddhism you're following, but it's certainly not theistic. There are some later forms of Buddhism in East Asia and stuff, but that move in a theistic direction, but that's different. So yes, of course, there are so many, Jainism, another good example of a strongly ascetic religion that does not believe in a God. And so
Don't they believe in the elephant god?
Jainism? No, I don't think so.
Because, well, I have a Jain student who did many Ganesha.
Yeah, well, the thing is, there's Jainism and there's Jainism. So there's the way it's popularly practiced, and then there's, if we talk about the original tenets of the religion, there are often differences there. So yes, it is possible, but as Gita says, always best to, if you have even an iota of bhakti, try to develop it, because it's the greatest help in spiritual life. Why does AA have this? Which is it, the second rule or the third rule? The dependence, surrender to a higher power? Number 2 or 3?
That's number 2.
Number 2. What's the exact? Do you know the exact wording of it?
Became willing to accept the higher power greater than yourself to restore you to sanity. And step 3 is surrendering to that higher power.
It says step 3 is surrendering to the higher power. So accepting, being open or receptive to a higher power is number 2. And number 3 is surrendering to that higher power. So why is that so important? Because you need to get outside yourself in order to, so same thing in Gita. There's a shloka in chapter 2 which talks about the need, there are a lot of shlokas about the need to control the senses. And then Krishna says, but it's extremely difficult. Even for spiritually advanced people, it's extremely difficult. Therefore, Krishna says, try to control the senses and matparaha, this tiny phrase which says, and rely on me, depend on me, God. Because without that, there's a great danger that you're going to get sucked back into the whirlpool of those same worldly addictions. So unless there's something outside yourself to really hold on to have as a kind of anchor, it's to very easily get sucked back in.
It's not really outside of yourself, isn't it? More inside.
Yeah, well, that's nice. I guess what I mean is outside the ego, outside that lower I, the rascal I. Something transcendental to hold on to. Yes, can you give the mic to?
That's okay. I mean, it's regarding the.
It's not okay, so just wait for the mic, please.
Okay, thank you.
Rajdeep.
Okay. So regarding karma, you said that it is carried forward to the next life, but Swamiji also has said you would have to face the consequences of the karma in this life. So if you already face the consequences...
Where does he say that? Not necessarily, though. I bet if you show me the exact quotation, I'd challenge you. Because, yes, what is karma? Karma means I do something. If it's dharmika, something good, what happens? It generates what's called punya. Punya. Virtue or merit. Okay? Then what happens? Eventually that merit will fructify. That punya will fructify. It could be in this life, but it need not necessarily be in this life. If it doesn't fructify in this life, it'll fructify in my next life. So I bet that Swamiji doesn't say that that you have to reap what you sow in this life. That's not possible. The prarabdha karma, there are different categories of karma. Prarabdha karma is the karma from our past that we've done in past lives that we will reap in this life. But there's more karma that we're going to reap in the future, only in a future life. Does that clarify the issue? Or have I misunderstood your question?
I think in Bengali he has said that karma phal ei jibonei bhog kore jete hoy.
Kore jete hoy means, see, that's different. What he's saying is you should try to work through your karma in this very life. What's the idea? So that you get liberation in this life. He's encouraging us as spiritual aspirants. Don't put it off and say, okay, I'll put it off a couple more lives and take a relaxed, laid-back attitude.
Yeah. So my question is,
life,
if you face the consequences of karma, so are you done with it? Would it get nullified, or
it depends on how you deal with it, right? So I mean, it could just be a vicious cycle if you have the wrong attitude. Right. Okay. So, do you have a concrete example in mind that you're thinking of, or?
No, I'm just thinking like if you have a punya, if you do a good karma, would that nullify the bad karma?
The karmic result is sukham, happiness. At least that's a standard model of karma. And if you do something bad, adharmika, what happens? It generates papa, demerit. What happens as a result? Unfortunate circumstances, unhappiness. Okay? And the idea is, even Holy Mother would say that if a person is in their last birth, and then, right before liberation, what happens? At the end of their life, they often fall very, very ill. They have terrible physical suffering for an extended period. She says the reason is because they have to work out that last residual karma that's keeping them to this worldly existence. And because they have to do it in this life, they have to get it over with quickly. What's the best way? Just experiencing suffering. So there's a kind of, when you experience intense suffering, that itself is burning off bad karma. Okay?
Of this life or the past life? That's the karma, I'm suffering from the karma of this life or from the past life?
It could be either. That's why some people, in India, there are some famous people who will do like these intense austerities of like putting themselves through terrible pain and suffering with the idea of exhausting bad karma, right?
Okay. Thank you.
I don't recommend that, though. Best thing is taking God's name.
Well, nowadays they have morphine to ease all of the pain and suffering for any patients who are near death.
Okay, morphine, yes. God's name is the ultimate morphine. How about that?
Well, if you're in pain and suffering of cancer, you want to have your relief
All right.
space and time so you're not suffering.
Yeah.
You should not have to suffer pain. Sorry, I disagree.
No, I think I agree. I think we agree. I think you want to disagree, but in fact I agree. All right, okay. Any last questions, comments? Thank you, guys. See you next month. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.